It is so good. I met a few folk from North Carolina on the way in, said they would help me get out of here if I make anybody too mad. Star Jones promised me she'd get me out the side door. We know folk. Sister Star, just give it up for Star Jones, who's with us. And to our president, who I have watched and studied and read all of the Urban League reports and used them in preaching and teaching, our president, President Mariel. Let's give him a hand this morning. Amen. To this dangerous praise team. You put that kind of singing with a justice movement, you got something. And it's kind of dangerous. I'm part Pentecostal, you know, so. Y'all got me this podium moving. Y'all know I might knock this right on over. Amen, amen. We thank God this morning. And I bring you greetings on behalf of repairers of the breach and our many people around the country and who are organizing. If you want to follow, just go to breachrepairers.org. And every first Sunday we have something now online called The Gathering. If you want to hear social justice, prophetic, social conscious teaching and preaching where we hold the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, you know, then join us on first Sundays at 6 o'clock. You just go to www.breachrepairers.org. I want to read from this little book I carry around called the Bible. The third chapter of Daniel says Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 80 cubits and the breadth thereof 60 cubits. And the Message Bible said he loved to build buildings. And verse 3 says he got everybody together, I'm paraphrasing, and dedicated the image that he put on this tower, this building. And verse 5 says, he told the nation, whenever you hear my music, I want you to bow down. And whosoever doesn't fall down and doesn't worship is going to be cast into the fiery furnace. Verse 12 says, but there were certain Hebrews who thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. But Nebuchadnezzar got mad with fury. Bring them to me. And he said to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image? Now, if ye be ready, that at the time when you hear the music, I want you to bow down. Otherwise, we're going to cast you that very hour into the fiery furnace. And who is it? Who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said, King Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer you in this matter. Now, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of thy hand. But if not, let it be known, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor bow down to your image. I want to, for a little while this morning, talk about bowing down is not an option. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Nebuchadnezzar provides us some lessons from the past, President Moriel, that inform us in the present. Nebuchadnezzar was a narcissistic egomaniac who loved to build buildings and put his name on them. I don't know why y'all are getting so excited, because I'm talking about something that was 2,600 years ago. Nebuchadnezzar loved having parades for himself. Nebuchadnezzar loved money. Nebuchadnezzar loved doing whatever he wanted to do with women. Nebuchadnezzar believed he and he alone had all the answers. Nebuchadnezzar had his own alternative facts. And Nebuchadnezzar had folk that would tell on you if you leak things out of his office. Nebuchadnezzar had his own false preachers and priests and prophets who prayed for him and seeded and fed his ego and taught him, even when he was wrong, that he was right. And Nebuchadnezzar wanted everybody to bow down to him. You want a job? Come to the tower, bow down to me. You want some money for HBCU? I don't know. I'm sorry. Apologize. Let me stay 2,600 years ago. Whatever you want, come about. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar's name in Hebrew literally means one who will do anything to hold on to power. Now, he came to power. Can I just teach a minute? He came to power, and he oppressed the Hebrew and the Jewish people. They were former slaves. He was oppressing them in this historical moment, in this, what we call in the seminary, Sitzenleben, the setting of the text. He was oppressing them because they were growing in power and influence. And he saw this as the last chance. And those who supported him saw this as the last chance to stop a growing diversity that would threaten the very life of Babylon. So he wanted to control their influence. He wanted to control their wealth. He even wanted to control their health. And he wanted to control their religion and their faith. He wanted them to live the way he wanted them to live. He wanted them to have what he wanted them to have. But he and those who supported him did not want them to fundamentally be able to change Babylon. Now, this is not just limited to 2,600 years ago. Every now and then, a narcissistic maniac will come to leadership position. It happened in 1877, just 12 years after the end of slavery. In 12 years, there had been something called Reconstruction. The laws of this country were rewritten, slavery was outlawed, voting rights were provided. Southern states, black and white people, poor whites, started working together in the South, took over every legislature in the South. Many of them were controlled by majority black membership, and if it wasn't majority black, it was black and progressive poor white folk that finally figured out that it was the slave masters, the rich ones, that made the poor white folk fight the Civil War, and that they were in the same boat as black people. But within 4 years, by 1870, 1872, deconstruction began. There was a group that said we can't have these people voting. Criminal laws, justice laws were rolled back. The former slave owners began to take over the courts. They ended the conversations about living wages that had begun in Southern constitutions in 1868, when constitutions were written in the South that said every person has a right to the enjoyment of your labor. Because just having labor without enjoyment of labor is a pseudo form of slavery. The Klan was founded in 1872 to attack white people who were working with black people. 1875, the Civil Rights Act was passed. It made it a federal law. It was a federal violation to violate black people's civil rights. That's why Dr. King in 1963 said 100 years later, he was saying, we already supposedly dealt with this. And things were changing in in America, and and this group of deconstructors who called themselves redeemers, they used a religious word in irreligious ways. Like some people now call themselves the evangelical right, but so much of what they say is wrong. That's a sermon for another day. But anyway, they called themselves redeemers, the redemption movement. But what they wanted to redeem was, they wanted to redeem America from the influence of black and poor white people working together. And so they had an election in 1877, and one candidate lost the popular vote. But he was a narcissistic maniac, and he wanted power. So he went to the southern states and said, if you'll give me the electoral college, I'll turn the South back over to you. I'll pull the troops out. I'll appoint who you want on the Supreme Court. And they did. Though he lost the popular vote, they gave him the electoral college. He appointed Supreme Court justices, and by 1883, the Civil Rights Act was overturned. There was only one dissenter, Justice Harlan out of Kentucky. By 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson was passed that made segregation the law of the land. 1898, riots broke out in Wilmington, North Carolina, where the wealthiest person in Wilmington was a black man. And black people owned the closest ports to Africa and Europe. And on December 10th, 1898, there was a coup d'etat that killed more people per capita than were killed on 9/11. Took that economic power, President Morial, from black people and progressive whites. And by 1901, all of the black congresspersons that had been elected during Reconstruction were run out of the United States Congress. And voting went down to almost zero in the South. Narcissistic leadership. It was narcissistic leadership in 1910 when the Urban League's roots began. You all came into existence to deal with black migration. Now, black folk weren't just leaving the South because they wanted to leave. They were leaving because they were being lynched. And you always got to be careful. You don't ever say black folk were hung. No, lynched is the word. I'd said that one time at a group that is actually now going around and getting soil from the lynching spots of every black person in the South. And they said, you don't say hung, because that suggests there was something, like they went through a legal court. No, lynching was terrorism. And black men would leave their families and go north so they could be, they thought, human and not deal with lynching. The Urban League was founded to deal with this migration because folk were leaving lynching in the South and ending up in ghettos in the North. That's why you were founded. Am I right? If I'm wrong, say help him, Jesus. The other reason you were founded is because black men were coming north and they had all these skills that had come up out of slavery because they had to learn how to fix everything. So they were good millwrights. But there was racism even in the union movement. And so black men were forced in the factories of the North to train white workers to do their job, and then they were made janitors and the whites were made mill workers. Narcissistic leader. We talk about Steve Bannon. Before Steve Bannon was in the White House, Woodrow Wilson was there. A Princeton, president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, narcissistic maniac who played the movie Birth of a Nation in the Oval Office, the first movie of sound that glorified the Ku Klux Klan, 1917, 7 years after the Urban League was founded. And he began to turn back desegregation of the federal government, all because and he was a Democrat, all because of his narcissistic desire for power. We saw it in 1963, the year I was born. George Wallace unleashes. Racism was there, but he, as a governor, spoke it so clearly: segregation yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And his words began to penetrate. It gave license. Be careful of these words. Be careful when leadership gets up and says, oh, just be rough on them, just throw them in the calling certain people criminals and murderers. And be careful of words from persons in high places. The power of life and death is in the tongue. George Wallace said segregation yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He was a narcissistic maniac because he had lost the election before. And George Wallace said, I'll never be out-niggered again. That's what he said. He said, I want to be in office so bad that I'll never be out-niggered again. And he said, I'll be the worst one they ever seen. I'll speak it, I'll loose it, I'll give it license. And what happened in 1963? After he spoke his inauguration speech, by June, Mega was dead. By September, 4 little girls in a church in Montgomery were dead. By November, a president was dead. 64 Swanner, Chain, and Goodman were dead. But the roots of that trace back to a narcissistic maniac with power, saying anything that would come on his mind. And you understand this history, then you understand that as it was in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, the election of Donald Trump is a symptom of a deeper malady. Now, I ain't talking Democrat or Republican. I'm talking something spiritual here. Y'all can play around with him if you want to. You got to understand. Dr. Neil Painter at Princeton says, what we have seen happen last year is as American as apple pie. She said, this ain't nothing strange in America. Stop talking about we've never seen this before. That means two things. You didn't pay attention in class in history, or they didn't teach it in history, and you don't know the Bible. This is nothing new. He begins his campaign pushing racism and xenophobia and hatred right after President Obama nail painter says there's this thing in the American ethos called call and response. There is a call for justice, and the response is injustice. There's a call for racial equality, and then right behind that is a call for more racism. It has happened over and over and over and over and over again in the American project. This election was really about undermining the influence of black, brown, and progressive white votes. This election was a reaction. Everybody knew he wasn't qualified to be president, but he was qualified to be the reaction. And that doesn't mean I agree with everything President Obama did, but I'm talking about this notion of a black man with a black wife, with a black mother-in-law, and black children living in a white house built by slaves messed some people up. And the only reason some of them voted is because the economy was so bad, they weren't thinking right. And then after they said, oh my God, what did we do? And you all know, like I know, black, white, it doesn't matter. If Obama had told one of the lies that Trump has told, they would have already got rid of it. And that not to say that I agree with all of Obama's policies. Neither does President Morale. Neither can any civil rights organization. We challenged him too. But this is something different. This is the attempt to block a third Reconstruction. The first Reconstruction was 1868 to the 1880s. The second Reconstruction was 1954 to 1968. And the election of, well, it wasn't really President Obama. It was the electorate when black and brown and white people came together, particularly in the South. And he broke through the Southern strategy and got Florida and Virginia and North Carolina and almost got South Carolina. That represented the possibility of a third Reconstruction. And what we see happening now is a Nebuchadnezzar spirit that's trying to block the transformation of America. I hope y'all don't mind me talking about spirits, because Nebuchadnezzar might be dead physically, but the spirit of Nebuchadnezzar, that narcissistic stuff still lives. And wherever that spirit lives and rises, there are four things it wants to do. Number one, stop the influence of power, of the people's power. Let me tell you, long before Russia hacked the system, and they did, that is not what hacked the American democracy. Racism, particularly voter suppression. People who are looking at the year 2020 and 2030 and 2040, and they see that there will no longer be any clear majority. The diversity of America will transform this country, and particularly transform the South. And if you transform the South and the Rust Belt and the Wheat Belt, then you transfer the whole country. And what they're trying to do is prevent a future that is coming. They're trying to slow it down. It's kind of like in South Africa, they used to say, only a dying mule kicks the hardest. Right. A wounded animal is dangerous, right? See, long before Russia, just put Russia aside, long before Russia, what we are seeing is this Nebuchadnezzar spirit in 2010 during the census redrew all of these lines and racially gerrymandered vote. The Brennan Center says there are 16 to 20 seats in the House of Representatives alone that probably wouldn't be in the category they're in if redistricting had been done fairly and not done from a racially motivated perspective. And now the courts, we just won a case where the courts are saying that we have racialized redistricting, the likes of which we haven't seen since Jim Crow. That is literally blocking and bleaching stacking and packing black voters. And in this era, Nebuchadnezzar got some of us working with him. See, it said Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't bow. It was a whole lot of other Hebrews in Babylon at that time. I know, Brother Morel, because when in North Carolina, the extremists, we don't call them Republican because they're not like Abraham Lincoln. They're not like my granddaddy who was a Republican and Whitney Young back then. They're not that kind of Republican. There's extremists. We had black leaders that came to me, president of the NAACP, and said, don't mess with this redistricting program because it's going to give me 80% in my district, 70% black vote in my district, and I won't have to work hard. Are you crazy? Now, you're going to take 70% in your district when you only need 45 if you work. And then that means that 35% of black folk who could be put in another district and may not elect a black person but could elect a progressive white person that owes black people for their existence, that will then vote on some policies that will uplift everybody. But because you simply want to be a black face, what in the help me? What difference does it make to be a black elected official and you can't even get a second? Can't get a vote out of committee because you want to get elected and live in a elected position rather than work for it. Now, the other thing that the Spirit has done is the Shelby decision, 2013. 5 members of the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and that unleashed these legislatures to pass all of the voter suppression, or not just photo ID, but voter suppression. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't want the influence. He wants to stop the influence. And so since then, you've had 22 states that have passed voter suppression laws. Say 22 states. 22 states. Those 22 states represent 54% of all Americans, African Americans, 44 United States Senate seats, 51% of the United States Congress. They suppressed the vote. They suppressed the vote. Say suppressed the vote. And every state that passed voter suppression laws also has high poverty, the lack of a living wage, and denied Medicaid expansion. So there's a direct connection between racism and classism and economic injustice. But it begins with the vote. Yeah. And you don't have to, it's deeper than that. See, the Southern strategy, Nebuchadnezzar's smart. Nebuchadnezzar said in 1968, after Dr. King was killed, he got together with a guy and said, look, if we can tie up 13 states in the South, we can control America for the next 50 years. Kevin Phillips wrote a little book on it. You ought to read it. Kevin Phillips, he advised Richard Nixon, right? And then Lee Atwater told it. He was on tape, and he still told it. He said, look, we decided that the way we could win was we had to find out a way to blame black folk for all of certain white folks' problems. But we couldn't use the N-word like George Wallace anymore, so we had to come up with code words like entitlement reform, tax cuts, right? And we had to say that laws like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were a violation of states' rights. You heard that? And they came up, he said, and then what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that poor whites in the South never combine themselves with blacks and Latinos, because if they do, they can transform the whole country. And he said, if we can do this successfully, put enough money behind it, get the Koch brothers to put a little money in it, if we can do this, because Nebuchadnezzar always got good funders, and if we can get a little money, then we can control 13 states. You say, but there's 37 states, Reverend Barber. That ain't no power. Wait a minute. 13 states from North Carolina over to Texas is 171 electoral votes. That means you only need 99 from the other 37 states. 13 states control 26 members of the United States Senate, which means you only need 25 of the other 37. 13 states control 31% of the United States House of Representatives, which means you only need 20% from the other 37 states. So if you control the South, and if you can pick up a few Rust Belt, you can get you a black whale out of Ohio to help you, then you can control the political process. You can control those who determine where the tax dollars go. You can control those who determine where investment go. That is the Nebuchadnezzar spirit. And when that spirit is alive, bowing down is not an option. But then there's a second thing Nebuchadnezzar wants to do. Nebuchadnezzar wants to control the wealth, baby. You remember when Speaker Boehner said, the poor have a notion that I don't really have to work. But you know what the reality is today? The nation's poor work full, a large share of the nation's poor work full time. It's one of the things that many people don't understand from bygone generations, because they thought if you had a job, you weren't poor. But the reality is now you can look. William Wilson, his work on sociology says this is a reality we have to get people to understand. You can actually work and work 60 or more hours a week and be poor. That corporations, CEOs, many of them make 300 and 400 times more than their average worker. And then they get subsidy from the government through food stamps and government services that go to their workers because they will not pay them a living wage. 73% of workers earning under $15 an hour nationwide are older than 25. We're not talking about kids working at fast food. 58 million workers, 44% of all workers make under $15 an hour. 42 million earn under $12 an hour. 125 million people, including over 31 million children, live in a household where at least one worker earning under $15 an hour. That's why Dr. King said at the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, if we aren't willing to deal with the issue of wages, we're just playing around the edges when it comes to dealing with poverty. There are 50 million people in the United States who are considered poor. Without Social Security, more than half of Americans 65 years and older would be in poverty. There are 14 million poor children in America 150 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. There are 24 million women living below the poverty line. There are 10 million African Americans, 24% living below the poverty line. There are 12 million Hispanic people, but watch this. There are 17 million white people, so there's 7 million more white people living in poverty than black. So then why would Trump go to an all-white audience to talk about black poverty? Trying to run a game on them, when reality, the policies of retrogression hurt black people more per capita, but in raw numbers actually hurt more white people. And until we can have a movement that helps folk understand that this is not about Republican versus Democrat. It's about this Nebuchadnezzar immoral spirit that wants to control 700,000 Native Americans in poverty, 4.4 million people with disabilities in poverty. But let me tell you, all a Nebuchadnezzar spirit sees and wants is more. I don't care about these millions. I just want more tax cuts. And if you give them to me, I'll let a little bit trickle down to fix the rest of you. The spirit doesn't care about what Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Peace Prize author, calls the cost of inequality. You ought to get that book. It ought to be required reading in the Urban League, the NAACP, in every church. The cost of inequality, where a Nobel Peace Prize lays out how much it costs to keep people poor. How much it costs not to pay people a living wage, what it's doing to our future. And he lays out in that book, he said, what kind of nation are we? What kind of spirit, this is my language, what kind of spirit is it that alive when you have in America today 250,000 people that die every year from poverty, according to the Mailman School of Public Health? When you have 400 families in this country that make an average of $97,000 an hour, while we are locking people up who simply want 15 and a union. What does that say about the moral deficit of our nation? What does it say? And when you couple that with the reality, long before the Russians hacked our system, did you know there were 900 fewer sites in voting sites in the black community, brown community, and poor white community this past election that suppressed hundreds of thousands of votes? Do you know the president, the 45, won by 30,000 votes in Wisconsin? There were 250,000 votes suppressed. But that Nebuchadnezzar spirit wants to control the power and wants to control the money. But it also, Nebuchadnezzar's spirit is strange, it also wants to control life and death. You know, I'm so sick in my, deep down on the inside about this debate we just went through. You know what the debate really was about? How many folk we gonna let die? Think about that. In the 21st century, we're supposed to be a civilized nation, and we just had a debate over how many people we're gonna let die. Because you know for every 500,000 people denied Medicaid expansion, 2,500 die, according to Harvard study, right? Then we had a debate about the deserving and the undeserving sick, when health is a human right. Huh? We're the only industrialized country in the world that had this conversation. The only one. All the other industrialized countries are trying to figure out how to do more health care. All of them have some form of universal health care. And we just went through, we weren't talking about how to get the other 32 million people that aren't even covered under Obamacare, which I believe that's a flaw. I've always wanted single payer and universal health care. There are 32 million people that aren't covered now. We weren't having that conversation. We weren't having a conversation about, well, if the senators got health care paid for by the people, if the Congress people got health care paid for by the people, how is it that you don't want the people that elected you to have the same thing you have? Do you realize how close we got yesterday? Yes, somebody say yesterday. Now, if you're from the country, say yes, did it. Yeah. Yesterday was the 52nd anniversary of the signing of Medicaid. We were that close to undoing Medicaid on its birthday. And how ruthless is your spirit, Nebuchadnezzar? When you want to hurt senior citizens and children and the disabled and the blind and the mentally ill and veterans, because that's who's on Medicaid. And the majority of the people on Medicaid are white. So you get power through racism, but then you use that power to hurt mostly whites, but then fool them to make them think that you're somehow hurting the undeserving poor. Let me see if I can bring this home. Say 700 billion. I won't even deal with the other number because it's going to be in the truth. Say 700 billion. I want you to say it again, 700 billion. Now they say Obamacare is failing. No, it's sabotaged. Because there are 22 states that refuse to expand Medicaid. And remember what I told you, those are the same state that also did voter suppression. And most of them in the South and in the Rust Belt and in the Midwest. But say 700 billion. Okay. Do you know the receipt ticket price of slaves in 1860? The receipt ticket price. No, I'm not talking about what you're worth, because you can't put a price on it. But racist slave masters paid for all the slaves in 1860 was $5.4 billion. $700 billion is 140 times more than the ticket price on slaves in 1860. And that's what they were getting ready to take. More money in the history of this country that has ever been taken and gotten from the bodies of people suffering since slavery. And the only time you can go back in history when there was a debate in the federal government about taking health care, you have to go all the way back to the Freedmen Bureau hospitals that were founded after slavery to help slaves, free black men, and poor whites. And by 1867, the former slave owners said, look, We've got to stop these hospitals. It was 42 of them, I think. The only one that survived was one at Howard, and there's another one somewhere. Howard survived. But they said, listen, we got to stop this, that Nebuchadnezzar spirit, because if we don't, these folk are going to live, and if they live, they're going to vote. And so they blamed it on tax cuts, and they ended the Freedmen Bureau. That's why we never got the 40 acres and a mule. But the first thing they took away was health care. Could it be, I don't know, but it's mighty strange that there's some folk still in this nation that have power, that have Nebuchadnezzar's spirit, that they don't want certain populations to live. Nebuchadnezzar wants control of the power. He wants control of the money. He even wants to control life and death. He said, if you don't bow, I'll kill you. But then finally, Nebuchadnezzar wants to control your religion, control your faith. Nebuchadnezzar, if you go read the text, had his own false prophets around him. Look at now the false prophets that have surrounded Trump, Ryan, and McConnell. How do I know they're false? Because they're so loud on things that God is so quiet on. They're so loud on prayer in the schools. They're so loud on being anti-abortion. They're so loud on attacking the gay community. Of course, many of them that loud end up proven gay, but that's a whole nother story. They're so loud. They're so loud on private rights, ownership. They're so loud on trying to make Jesus an original member of the NRA. Now, the problem with me, Brother Morale, see, I ain't one of these Negro preachers that went to school before I went to prayer meeting. See, I learned the book. I taught the book. I come from a tradition style where the preachers knew how to make the book talk. So I read the Bible for myself, and what bothers me is how can people be so loud on what God says the least about and so quiet on what God says the most about? Now, there might be 3 scriptures in the Bible about homosexuality, and most of them are misinterpreted, and none of them trump the scripture, you got to love your neighbor as yourself. I wish I had a witness here. Huh? You can't trump that love scripture now. You see what I'm saying? But on the other hand, there are 2,500 scriptures in the Bible about how you treat the poor, how you treat the least of these, how you treat the women, how you treat the children. But Nebuchadnezzar's spirit doesn't want us to know that, because they want our faith to all be messed up. That's how they did. They didn't want the slaves to read the text about liberation, so they created slave Bibles and took charcoal and put it over all the scriptures about deliverance. And that's why last week when the folk got mad when I said, you don't just go pray for a president. That's not the biblical instruction. You can pray, but you have to first give them the word of God. You give them the word of God, and then you pray that they do the will of God. You don't just go feed a leader's ego. No, you don't just do that. You have to be a prophet in their midst. Say, thus saith the Lord. But many have sold their souls to money. And so they're not telling Ryan, McConnell, and Trump what they need to hear, just like many people didn't tell the slave master what they needed to hear. It was Rabbi Heschel that told John F. Kennedy in 1963. He went to him and met with him and said, Mr. Kennedy, you forfeit your right to worship God if you don't do right by the Negro people. Whether there's a president or the governor like the one in the state of Missouri, I see you. The Bible says, Isaiah 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their right. Ezekiel 22 says, your politicians have become like wolves when they devour the poor of my people. Ezekiel 16 says, Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed because it didn't care for the poor and the needy. It didn't have nothing to do with gay people. Jeremiah 22 says, tell the leaders to attend to justice and protect the
innocent. Proverbs says that you're to speak up for the poor. Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. The word poor there is a Greek word, patokos, which means those who've been made poor by economic exploitation. Matthew 25 says that God will not say to individuals, but that God will say to the nations. God will say to governments, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick, did you care about me? And so, in the last few minutes that I have, I've come by to say that there's some things that are not about left versus right, but about right versus wrong. And whenever the spirit of Nebuchadnezzar is at work, there has to be a Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego coalition. And that coalition must say things might not change tomorrow, and they might not change next week. But right now, bowing down is not an option. That's why Brother Morial and I are going to talk, because there's some clergy, and we're hooking up with some poor people. And we think next year we ought to have 40 days of action. We ought not remember the Poor People's Campaign. We ought to finish the Poor People's Campaign. And what would happen if in 25 states and the District of Columbia, every week 150 people went into the state capitol and 450 people went into the offices of Ryan and McConnell around an agenda, an anti-poverty agenda, a pro-living wage agenda, a pro-healthcare agenda, a pro-education agenda, a pro-fairness in the criminal justice system, a pro-expanding voting rights agenda, a pro-equality for everybody. And what if we went in and sat down as a sign of our standing up and made folk have to arrest us in 25 states and the District of Columbia and tell them, you might have the Congress, you might have the presidency, you might even have state legislatures, but bowing down is not an option. Nebuchadnezzar told these boys to bow down, but he didn't understand. They refused to drink the wine at Mar-a-Lago. They refused to eat the food at his hotel. They couldn't bow down because bowing down wasn't in their DNA. They came from Moses. They came from Joshua, like we come from Harriet, and we come from Frederick. And they looked him in his eye, and they said, O King, the God that we serve, he can deliver. But if not, bowing down is not an option. How many folk in here got but if not faith? I'm not talking about but if faith. What if it's easy? What if it's no struggle? Is there anybody in here that's got but if not? What if it doesn't stop raining? What if it's not easy? What if I have to risk my life? There's one thing I'm not doing. I'm not bowing down to Nebuchadnezzar, because I serve a God who looks high, who sits high, but he looks mighty low. And I'm telling you what a poet said. If we don't fight, if we don't resist, if we don't organize and unify and get the power to control our lives, then we will wear the exaggerated look of submission, the bizarre look at suicide, the dehumanized look of fear, and the decomposed look of oppression forever and forever and forever. But do I have any witnesses here? Is there anybody here that says we've come too far to turn back now? Are there any modern day Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego here? What if we put together the poor, the clergy, and the civil rights organizations and called it the modern day Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego coalition? What if we stand? Tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, these are going to be some fiery times. Ain't no need for me to lie to you. But don't you tell them, but don't you know, if you stand in the fire, the Lord will stand with you. My Bible says that he threw them in, but another one came in there with him. there was a pre-incarnation of that black brother named Jesus. He stood in the fire with them. And the Bible says when they came out of the fire, you couldn't even smell the smoke on them. Tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, you can't smell what I've been through, because God has been mighty good to me. Slap your neighbor a high five and say, neighbor, say, falling down is not an option. Looking down is not an option. Standing down is not an option. Bowing down is not an option. Now one day I will bow when justice comes, when we stand before the Lord, when the lion lays down with the lamb, when the rough places are made smooth and the crooked places are made straight and the high places are made low and the valleys are exalted and the glory of the Lord is revealed. When I see the Lord face to face, I'll bow then. But until then, bowing down is not an option. What do you do when you've done all you can and it seems like it's never enough? You just stand when there's nothing else to do. You just stand and the Lord will see you through. Tell your neighbor, neighbor, it's standing time.